think it looks like we're ready to get started. Chairs are still on their way, so those will come in and we can just kind of add them in the back once they arrive. And we're going to get started. So welcome to the Niagara Falls Amtrak Station and the Niagara Falls Underground Railroad Heritage Area. My name is Allie Spunger. I'm the Director and Curator at the Heritage Center. We also have some of our board members in the audience I'd like to point out. Bill Bradbury over here. We've got Denise Easterling in the back over here. And Mark Onesi way over there in the back as well. So we welcome them to be here as well for tonight for our big kickoff event. This event here is also
Attention Amtrak passengers.
This is going to happen
Each
throughout the
ticketed
night.
traveler is allowed up to 2 carry-on bags, not exceed 5 lbs each, and must meet size, type, and content requirements. Please contact the Amtrak agent or refer to posted carry-on baggage signage for details prior to boarding your train.
Since we are in a train station, this will happen throughout the presentation, so Judy is just going to roll with it. So this event here tonight is part of the Trailblazing Women's Speaker Series, celebrating the centennial of women's suffrage in New York State. So this is one of the events. We want to say a big thank you to the Buffalo History Museum that had hosted the previous events prior to this one, and there will be more coming as well. From here, I want to say a couple thank yous to some of our other partners and sponsors. The Association for a Buffalo Presidential Center, the Niagara Falls National Heritage Area, the Erie County Commission on the Status of Women, the AAUW Buffalo Branch, Friends of Women's Rights National Park, Zonta Club of Buffalo, League of Women Voters, Buffalo Niagara, Woman Elect, Damon College Women's Studies Program, and the Buffalo History Museum. So next I'm going to bring up Joan Bozert, who is one of the founders of the Association for Buffalo Presidential Center. Welcome, Joan.
Hello. Our president, Mary Ann Friedman, wasn't able to be here this evening, and she sends her regrets. But we do have several members of our board here. Brad Hunt, Sandra Williams-Bush, Linda Berganza, Bob and Grassi. Are you all, raise your hand? The Buffalo Presidential Center encourages building public awareness of the contributions of President Millard Fillmore and Grover Cleveland to the presidency and national affairs through programming and exhibits, but we're also interested in those who have shaped our nation's policies in government, the judiciary, policy making, and public affairs. Our Trailblazing Women's Speaker Series tonight is focusing on a woman whose courageous actions had a huge impact on Western New York and our nation. We're so proud to collaborate with the Niagara Falls Underground Railroad Heritage Area, who have done an outstanding job for organizing this evening's program. So Allie Spunger will set the stage for our outstanding speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan. So Niagara Falls was truly a unique location during the time of the Underground Railroad, and it still is today. It is here that many freedom seekers left the land of slavery for the land of freedom just across the river in Canada. Right out here, right outside of the building, is where Harriet Tubman and many others had crossed on the Suspension Bridge. And also, very importantly, Dr. Wellman today is going to talk about Harriet Tubman and also some of the important actions and history here of the Underground Railroad and the abolitionists and local African-American wait staff at the Cataract House Hotel and International, among many others. Dr. Judith Wellman will be sharing the extraordinary Harriet Tubman from slavery to freedom and beyond. Dr. Wellman has been working to discover extraordinary people and places in time, and she specializes in finding historic sites in New York State relating to the ideal of equal rights for all people, with a special focus on the Underground Railroad, women's rights, and African American history. She is a professor emerita at the State University of New York at Oswego and principal investigator at Historical New York Research Associates. Most recently, Dr. Wellman published her new book, Brooklyn's Promised Land, The Free Black Community of Weeksville, New York. We also work very closely with Dr. Wellman, and she has worked extensively on helping us design and providing the historical research for the new Underground Railroad Heritage Center exhibits that will be opening in March 2018 right over here in this space. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Judith Wellman.
Hi, it is wonderful to see you all here. I mean, it's just thrilling, is it not? And to be in this place at this time of both the history of Niagara Falls and the history of the country and the world. So I thank you all for coming and for the people who've sponsored this wonderful series. And I also want to say what a pleasure it has been to work with the team of people here with the Niagara Falls Underground Railroad Commission who are fabulous to work with. And it's also wonderful to discover these historic people. The reason I do the work I do is because I get to meet these wonderful people in the past, including Harriet Tubman, whom people in Auburn often call Aunt Harriet. And she will be here after the program, so you can come up and get your picture taken with her if you would like to do so. This will be about 40 to 45 minutes. We'll go fairly quickly. So if you have questions, keep them in mind, and then we'll have 15 or 20 minutes of questions and answer at the end. The photograph you see on your left has recently been discovered. Some of you may know something about it. It was in a scrapbook kept by a woman named Emily Holland, who lived a little bit south of Auburn in a place called Sherwood. People called her Miss Emily, so you will meet her as well in this story. And this is dedicated to all those people who have worked and continue to work so hard to uncover these fabulous stories, and also to the sustaining power of families. I think that's what really motivated Harriet Tubman, and it's what motivates much of us today. And Kate Clifford Larson is by far the best scholar. Tubman probably has more books, a lot of them kids' books, than any other living American about her. This is the very best one, and Kate's been wonderful in working with us here too. We all know, or we think we know, something about Harriet Tubman. And if you think of what you might say, she looks like she's a fairly simple person, not fancily dressed. She looks like she's a very serious woman. Certainly was a courageous woman, went 13 times back to the South and brought out about 70 people directly and many more indirectly. She had a strong spiritual base. And today she has become one of America's greatest heroes. And in this time of change and often trouble in this country and this world, I ask you to think about that and think about why people may find her so very attractive for us now and what she has to say. She was called in her own time the Moses of her people, and in many ways she seems larger than life. She's certainly one of America's best known citizens, and if you had to say, who do you know from the 19th century that lived in New York State? Probably one of them would be Harriet Tubman, and the other one would be Frederick Douglass. It would not be Roscoe Conkling. I think one reason we're so attracted to her today is that she epitomizes these ideals of justice, equality, respect for people. One of her biographers, Milton Surnett, has written that her story is really the quintessentially American story. Think about that. A black woman, I'm arguing she was disabled, short, 5 feet tall, epitomized for many people then and many of us now the ideals upon which this country was founded, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, and we might say women, are created equal, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Harriet Tubman took that seriously. But she was more than an icon, more than a myth. She was a real person. And if we look at historical sources, some of which we've known about for a long time, some of which are newly discovered, like that photograph, we can begin to understand more about the reality of her life and also about the Underground Railroad. And that's the beyond part of that title, thinking about a way in which her life illustrates the work of the Underground Railroad, especially in New York State where we live.
And have your travel documents ready for scanning by the conductor prior to boarding your train. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. If you were going to pick a hero today, would it be a person of color? Would it be a woman? Would it be a woman who had frontal lobe epilepsy, probably, and was prone to fits, headaches, falling asleep? Would it be a person who was short and slight, only 5 feet tall? She's not the traditional hero that we think of in terms of American history. And yet she was an extraordinary woman. And I'd like to think about the way she was growing up in Maryland, her work on the Underground Railroad, her work in the Civil War, and then her move to Auburn and living in freedom after the Civil War, where she lived longer than any other place in her life. And then think a little bit about the way in which her life and the way we're rediscovering it has meaning for us as we look at historic sites and at tourism and heritage tourism today. I think her early life set the stage for what she became, and she early on was enmeshed in family and community, and I think that ideal motivated her. She was a caregiver above all else for the rest of her life. She was born Araminta Ross at 1822 in Dorchester County, Maryland, which is a flat, low area on the eastern shore of Maryland. This is the road to that led to the cabin of her parents, Ben and Harriet Ross, where she lived with 4 brothers and 4 sisters. It was on Maryland's eastern shore, which today is part of the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge. And she worked very hard as a young girl in this flat, marshy area, and was strongly influenced by the landscape and also by the fact that she worked a lot with her father and her brothers, so that she was out of the house, and she, even as a young girl, was put to work in cold, damp marshes catching muskrats. As she grew older, she actually she was able to buy a yoke of oxen, and she would carry logs working with her father and brothers. She was sent to this store. This is actually not the original, but it's a 1870 store in Bucktown when she was 13 years old, just to do some errands. And Kate Larson talks about how she was upset. She's a 13-year-old girl. She said, "Oh, my hair's just a mess. It's just all cubbied out." So she put a big shawl over her hair. And that may have been what saved her life, because the store owner was trying to recapture a guy who was running away, and Harriet Tubman got in the way, Harriet Ross at that time, and her head was hit, and she had a fractured skull. It left her for the rest of her life in extreme and frequent suffering with headaches and seizures and sleeping spells, and also seemed to have contributed to her spiritual visions, which she frequently had. The area in which she grew up on the eastern shore of Maryland was in economic decline. It had been a tobacco area. It was switching to wheat and corn. And one of the ways in which enslavers would make money would be to sell the people they quote unquote owned farther south to Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, where there were newly opened lands being used for cotton production. So it was a period and a place when the splitting apart of families through sale was very common and a major threat. And 3 of Tubman's sisters were sold south, and they never heard from them again. They did leave small children behind, and there's one we'll talk about in a bit. So in 1849, Harriet Tubman and her brothers were about to be sold. Her owner, quote unquote, her enslaver, Edward Brodus, had died. His widow was trying to raise money, Eliza, and she decided she would sell her assets. Harriet Tubman heard about this and took off. And she said later, there are 2 things I have a right to. One of these is death, one is liberty, and I'm going to have one or the other. And she made it to Philadelphia, and then began to go back in one of the first of several trips 13 in all, trying to bring out her family and her nieces and nephews and brothers out of slavery, and her parents. And they didn't always meet her as they expected, so she would bring other people that were there and able to go. Her first rescue in 1850 was of her niece Keziah Bowley, and Keziah had 2 kids. Eliza Brodus was going to sell her at this courthouse. She was married to a free person of color, and he bid on her and his children and won the bid. Now somehow they took a break for lunch, and in between him winning the bid and them coming back from lunch, he took off with his wife and 2 kids, got a small boat, and met Harriet Tubman in Baltimore. So it was a successful rescue, and they ended up at Chatham, Ontario, and then eventually went back to Dorchester County. That began Tubman's formal work on the Underground Railroad. We so much associate her today with the Underground Railroad, it's almost like Tubman Underground Railroad, that we forget that she used a well-established, already existing network when she began. The Underground Railroad had been going on for many years, and particularly after 1827 when New York State abolished slavery. So by the time Tubman connected with it, there was a large, well-known to people in the know, group of people, and the routes were pretty well established, and so were the transportation patterns. I just like this, so I threw it in. It's a NASA photograph of upstate New York, and you can see why New York State's geography was so important. This is the Hudson River, the Albany area going across the Mohawk River, Oneida Lake. Every place, Oswego, Pulteneyville, Rochester, Lewiston, Youngstown, Niagara Falls, every place that there was access to a way to get to Canada became an Underground Railroad center in New York State. And the turnpikes and the railroads followed those water routes. So it's kind of like an upside T that's on its head. You can go up this way, up Lake Champlain, it takes you right to Canada, this way to the west. All of these Finger Lakes point directly to Canada. They're like arrows, and a lot of people used all of those routes. Slavery ended in New York State in 1827, and there was a widespread grassroots support for abolitionism. One of the ways that it manifested itself was under Governor William Henry Seward. In 1840 and 41, New York State passed 3 laws that were really important legal precedents for helping people escape. And abolitionists, both black and white, including the waiters at the Cataract Hotel, were very aware of this legal situation and used them. Previous to this time, if you were an enslaver and you brought someone into New York State, if they stayed for 9 months, they would be free. So what people would do is bring them in for 8.5 months and then take them back to Virginia for 3 weeks and then bring them back. This law said, once you cross the border into New York State, you are free. And it also granted a trial by jury to people accused of being fugitives. And it also allowed the governor to appoint a special counsel in case of kidnapping free people of color in New York State. This was implemented or inspired by the case of James Watkins Seward, whose picture you see here, who went to this church in my own hometown of Fulton, New York. It was also the law that was used to get Solomon Northbrook back from Louisiana. You probably know his story of 12 years a slave. And those laws really, people knew about them. They were very sophisticated about what the legal situation was. And they greatly strengthened New York State's Underground Railroad and helped people escape from slavery. A lot of people who escaped through New York State, like Harriet Tubman, came from Maryland's Eastern Shore, partly because there was that threat of sale, continued threat of sale, partly because of violence. Slavery would never survive without extreme physical violence. partly because there was an active network of Underground Railroad supporters, both black and white, partly because there were good routes and people knew about them, about how to escape. So some examples were James Pennington, who escaped in 1828, became a Presbyterian minister. A lot of these people wrote memoirs, which are available online, especially collected on a site called docsouth.edu if you want to follow any of them up. In the mid-30s, African Americans in New York City formed the Vigilance Committee. And they were explicitly organized to help people escape kidnappers or to escape from slavery. And when Frederick Douglass and his fiancée Anna Murray came through in 1838, James Pennington married them, and they stayed with David Ruggles of the Vigilance Committee. So people were well organized, or fairly well organized, very early. And they were organized enough to begin to send agents into the South, into the Maryland, D.C. area from New York State, to find people there and actually put them on the network and get them free. First one to do that was a major effort, was Charles Torrey, who was caught. He worked with a black man named Thomas Smallwood, who has an autobiography. And Torrey was caught, sentenced to 6 years of hard labor, and died in a Maryland jail in 1846. William Chaplin took over from him, went to D.C., very traumatic stories, but he himself attempted to get 2 enslaved people out of D.C. who were owned by major Southern politicians in 1850. Unfortunately, he was caught. The idea was that he would ride in triumph with 2 African Americans, formerly enslaved people, into this big fugitive slave convention in Casanova, New York, and show that New Yorkers were not going to pay attention to the Fugitive Slave Act. Chaplin was caught. The Fugitive Slave Convention took this very famous photograph to send to him in jail. He had a $20,000 bail. They raised the money in New York State to get this guy out of jail. Tubman found help from many people along her route. One of the most important was Thomas Garrett in Delaware, who estimated that about 2,700 people came through his home escaping from slavery, and he was very impressed with Frederick Douglass, with her spirituality, with her visions. She said to him once, "I need shoes for the people I'm bringing." And he said, "Where am I going to get shoes?" And suddenly a donation came from a woman in England with money that paid for the shoes. And Tubman wasn't surprised. She said, "This just happens. This is how it's going to be." But Thomas Garrett wasn't so sure it was going to be that way. But Tubman often went through William Still's office in Philadelphia, and he wrote in 1872 a book called The Underground Railroad that still has wonderful stories, including stories of people who came through here in Niagara Falls. And then they went, as anybody would go, up the Hudson River to Albany, west to Syracuse, Rochester, Niagara Falls. New York City became what some people call the Great Receiving Depot, and we now have a newly discovered record of people coming through the New York City Vigilance Committee's office that parallels the records that William Still kept in Philadelphia. And again, there's material from Tubman and the people that went through with her, describing her and the people she was taking. Then people might go north. They might take a steamboat or the railroad. Steamboats had almost entirely African-American male people who were stewards. And they became, as did Stephen Myers, very active in the Underground Railroad as they helped other people. He was in Albany. there were 500 enslaved people that the Eastern New York Anti-Slavery Society said they helped in 1842 and 43. I like this quote, so I put it in. Fugitives, the cry is still they come. 2 yesterday morning, 2 this morning. Will our friends send in funds to defray the expense of forwarding them? Money, money, friends. What's new, right? Because they would buy them railroad tickets. In Syracuse, Germaine and Caroline Logan kept the main Underground Railroad station by the mid-1850s. And Germaine Logan has an autobiography. It estimated that 1,500 people came through their home. And people called Canada, Syracuse, the Canada of the North. They called Germaine Logan the prince or the king of the Underground Railroad. Syracuse was the Grand Central Depot. So by the 50s, they're using these railroad images fairly commonly. Another place that I like, because it's related also to the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention, so it brings it back to the suffrage movement, was the home of Thomas and Mary Ann McClintock in Waterloo, New York, who signed the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments at the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention. So a lot of these abolitionists were also early women's rights supporters. Central New York, the Finger Lakes region, also became a major crossroads. Thomas and James Hart escaped from Maryland about 1840, and I put this in because it's got an actual passage note. These are very, very rare, written to Slocum Holland and his family, introducing them to Thomas and James Hart. And one of the Hart brothers actually stayed in the Sherwood, Auburn area and bought this house, which is still standing. It's now owned by Wells College. He married a young woman who was a New York State African American. Sherwood became a major Underground Railroad node because of the Holland family. And this is Slocum Holland, Emily Holland, and their dog Grant, which they loved. They loved it so much that when Grant died, they sent him to Cornell to have his brain autopsied because they thought he was so brilliant. So here's my one joke, well, except maybe one that Harriet told, of the evening. You know the old saw, who's buried in Grant's tomb? Obviously Grant. But when, I mean Ulysses S., but when Slocum Holland died, he loved that dog so much that he was buried in Grant's tomb. And I guess he's still there with him. One of the families that came to Sherwood, like the Hart brothers, stayed, and they bought this house. Herman and Hannah Phillips came walking from Maryland with their, do you want me to keep talking? Yeah. With their 4 children, one of them they carried on their back from Maryland, and they settled and lived here, and their descendants still live there. And one of Harriet Tubman's descendants, Pauline Copes Johnson, who still lives in Auburn, this is her visiting her. She said, "Oh, that's my aunt." And we went to look at her grave because she had intermarried with the Tubman family and the Tubman descendants. Garrett Smith was a wealthy landowner who had a major investment in port facilities in Oswego, New York. They say he was getting $1 million out of there in 1860. I can't tell you if that's true or not. But he used that whole port facility as a place for people escaping on the Underground Railroad. And of course, there'd be not only sympathetic US captains, but Canadian captains coming into that port. And then in Rochester, Frederick Douglass moved in 1847 and was a key component of the Underground Railroad. He worked a lot with Quakers, and this picture is of Daniel and what's her mother's name? Anthony. They're Susan B. Anthony's parents, and we know that Tubman was at their house in 1860, so she too was part of this Quaker Frederick Douglass network. 1850 becomes a major turning point for the Underground Railroad, and you can probably guess why. The Fugitive Slave Act, part of an attempt to create compromises that would keep the Union together in 1850, said that if there were so many people escaping from slavery that Southern enslavers really wanted the federal government to play a role in bringing people back. And so federal marshals anywhere in the country, this is very similar to what's going on with sanctuary cities and refugees today. The federal government is asking local officials to play a part in capturing people who are here undocumented. So even if you did cross the line into New York State and you were free because of New York State law, if anyone found you, they could call a federal marshal, or you could be your enslaver could empower someone to get you. If you were helping someone, you could pay a fine of up to $1,000 a piece, and you could spend up to 6 months in jail. So suddenly the ante is upped. And at the same time, technological developments in transportation mean that far from by land, walking or taking a stagecoach, suddenly you're able to take railroads, steam, not just from one little place to another, but in 1853 there were 7 short railroad lines across New York State. They were all consolidated into the New York Central, which is now the Amtrak system, and that's why it's so important that we're here today. Hearing those announcements is very appropriate, I think. And so there was a straight line from Albany to Niagara Falls on the railroad. So people began, who were escaping from slavery, began to find support from local people who would raise money to buy tickets. One story about coming to Jermaine and Carolyn Logan's. Logan put a whole group of people on the train in Syracuse, and he said to the conductor, "I want you to see these people get right across the bridge into Canada." And they did. They just rode right across the bridge. A lot of this traffic with both the New York Central and then the Erie was across the southern tier, but there was a connection from Elmira up to Canandaigua up to Niagara Falls. So those 2 train stations would meet in Niagara Falls. They'd go across this brand new suspension bridge, which opened in March 1855, and Harriet Tubman took advantage of that new way of crossing the river. One of the main group of people who helped people escape through Niagara Falls, beginning much earlier in the 30s and 40s, were waiters who were employed at the major hotels. They were entirely African-American men. And the census reports suggest, I said half to 2/3, but I counted it again, and I think in 1850s, more like 80% of them listed a birthplace as a southern state or Canada, or told the census taker, "Gosh, I don't know where I was born." That's a red flag that they had escaped from slavery, and who would want to tell a federal official coming to your door saying, "Where were you born?" It's none of your business, and I don't remember. So the Parkhurst Whitney and later his sons and sons-in-law were hiring people who had escaped from slavery. It's an early example of don't ask, don't tell. And they were well organized, both in terms of their job, in terms of their service, but also in terms of their willingness and ability to confront people. So the hotel was full of people from the South who would bring their servants. And there are stories about waiters who would go up to them and say, "You're in New York State, you're free, do you want to go across the river?" And a lot of them said, "Yeah." But what you had to do, the next time you look at Niagara Falls, think about this. You had to go to Prospect Point. There was a ladder straight down, a stair straight down the cliff. At the bottom was this little rowboat that might take 6 or 7 people. And the foam and the mist of Niagara Falls and the sound of it is right there. Can you imagine having made it from Maryland and somebody says, "You got to go down to the Niagara River, you got to get in this little boat, I'm going to row you across"? You might actually say, maybe I made a mistake. It just sounds, and this, I bet you can hardly even find the boat in this picture here. This is it. It was designed originally and it was used for tourists. It was a tourist attraction. It was owned by Parkhurst Whitney and Augustus Porter, so it's the same guy who owns the Cataract Hotel. There are lots of thrilling escapes. They demand a movie, but here's one about Martha, who was coming up the steps of the cataract, and she saw her enslaver. And he reaches out his hand to say, "Oh, hi, Martha." And she says, "Not on your life." And she takes off for the river of Prospect Point. Her husband follows her. The waiters follow her. The owner, quote unquote, follows her, saying, "A reward for anybody who catches that woman." And she takes the steps 2 at a time. She's so excited. She's got to get to the boat and leaps into the boat. And the rower goes right off into the river just as the owner comes down those stairs, and she makes it. She escapes. After the suspension bridge became a railroad bridge in '55, a lot of people would take the railroad and not have to go across on the ferry. And here's some images. You'll see a lot more about this when you come to the new exhibit opening. And this was the way that Harriet Tubman tended to go after the bridge was opened. One of the most famous stories was of a trip she made in November 1856 with Peter Pennington, and there's a reward poster for him here. And Joe and William Bailey and a woman named Eliza Minoki. And it's famous because she described it in great detail in her autobiography in 1868. And especially, it also shows her sense of humor. I mean, you look at Harriet Tubman and she looks so serious. But with Joe, they had gone to New York City. Joe's this really big, tall guy, and he thinks, "Oh, I've made it." But he sees posters for his capture in New York City. And he says, "Oh no, I'll never get out, I'll never get out." So Tubman talks about taking the train from New York City to Niagara Falls, and everybody else is singing and happy. And Joe's sitting there so depressed. "Oh, I just can't, I'm never gonna make it." So they're going across the suspension bridge, and Tubman says, "Joe, look at the falls, look at the falls." And he says, "Oh no, I can't, I'm never gonna make it." And they get to the Canadian side. Joe leaps out, gets on his knees on the ground and kisses the earth and makes what Tubman thinks is a fool of himself. But he says, "Finally, I'm on my way to heaven." And Tubman says to him, "Well, Joe, you could at least have looked at the falls before you got to heaven." But I like that because it's the only joke I ever heard her tell. I mean, I didn't hear her, but yeah, you know what I mean. She went, like so many people who took this route, she settled in St. Catharines, Ontario, which today has the Salem Chapel and a very nice exhibit. It's still, it's a British Methodist Episcopal church. And she brought her family there and settled that whole family and a lot of friends and neighbors in that neighborhood. And then during the Civil War, she left St. Catharines and began to change her role. She worked with Union troops, and she was a nurse. She was with the 54th Massachusetts. She was a scout. She was a spy. Here are 2 of the most famous incidents she was involved with. Colonel James Montgomery recognized how good she was at spying and being a scout, because she could go into plantation areas and talk to people who were enslaved, and they would tell her who was where and what was going on. So she was able to steer these federal gunboats up the Combahee River near Beaufort, South Carolina. And on June 2nd, 1863, Colonel Montgomery said, "We can take people to freedom. Get them on board these boats and we will take them away from slavery." Well, they were a little suspicious. You know, they got kids, they got chickens. What am I doing? I don't know if I trust these guys. So she got up and she sang this song, which was had been written by the Hutchinson family singers. They were a white abolitionist family from New Hampshire. And she said, come along, don't be a fool. Uncle Sam is rich enough to send us all to school. And they bought it. More than 700 people, some people say as many as 800 people, came on board the gunboat. So, you know, if she made 13 trips to Maryland, saved about 70 people, probably told another 70 people how to get north walking and on boats and trains. But if you count the 700 to 800 she got out of slavery in South Carolina as the only woman known to lead a military raid in the Civil War. And then a little over a month later, she was with the 54th Massachusetts at Fort Wagner. She fed them their breakfast before they went into this horrendous battle. They lost 250 people. But one of the most famous descriptions that she had was this one, and I'll just read it quickly because it seems so powerful to me. And then we saw the lightning, and that was the guns, and then we heard the thunder, and that was the big guns, and then we heard the rain falling, and that was the drops of blood falling, and then we came to get in the crops, and it was the dead men that we reaped. After the war, she moved to Auburn, New York, where she lived the rest of her life, and in fact, more years than anywhere else, in freedom. In 1859, now try this one on for size. I'm still trying to figure this out. William Henry Seward and his wife Frances live in Auburn. William Seward is the same guy who was governor when they passed those 1840-41 laws. He's since gone on to become, he's now U.S. Senator. He's going to be Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln. As a U.S. Senator, he is bound to obey the Constitution and laws of the United States, right? Instead of turning Harriet Tubman in, he says, how about if I sell you 7 acres of land that belonged to my wife's father? You can have the farm. He did. This U.S. Senator sold Harriet Tubman, this young black woman, 7 acres of land in 1859. It was too cold for her parents to live there, and so people didn't start moving until the middle of the Civil War. But by 1865, the census shows 12 people living in her household. A lot of them are her brothers or her nieces and nephews. And she used her home as a kind of, you may be familiar with the idea of kind of chain migration. One person gets established, you bring the rest of the family, and then they go on. That's what she's doing. And there are many buildings now in Auburn that relate to her family that her family bought. Here are a couple of them. Tubman married after her first husband died. Nelson Davis was a Civil War veteran. They adopted a daughter, Gertie, who's second from the right, between Nelson and Harriet. And she maintained all this time a house. She kept her house open for people who were poor or in need or elderly. She just was such a caregiver, like a prototypical nurse. And she also, at the same time, maintained close relationships with a group of women and men who had been abolitionists and that were then going into the women's suffrage movement. Among them was Mary Talbert, who was president of the National Association of Colored Women and a strong woman suffragist. Susan B. Anthony, she spoke well Harriet Tubman spoke at a suffrage convention in Rochester. One of her most famous sayings you may have heard is that I was conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years, and I could say what almost nobody can. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger. And then another one who kept in touch with her was Emily Howland, who kept this scrapbook from which we just rediscovered the earliest photograph we have of Harriet Tubman. In 1896, she bid on 25 acres of land next door to her farm. And it had 2 buildings, and she wanted to create a formal home for the aged. She lived here in one of the buildings herself until she died March 10th, 1913, at age 31. And she died as she had lived, surrounded by her family and her friends. The Empire State Federation of Women's Clubs, part of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, bought her tombstone. And it's still, actually they replaced it in 1937, but some of you may have been there. It's there. It's become a pilgrimage site. There's a lot of visitors every year. So what does this all mean for us? There's a lot going on in terms of heritage tourism because it's of interest to all of us, and also because it's an investment in economic development. If you think about heritage tourism, its basis is authenticity. And so when you have something, as you do here, that's really a real place where these things happened, it's an asset that I think is important and thrilling, actually, to begin to develop. There have been lots of surveys of tourists, and one of them is done by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. If you ask people who are tourists, why did you come? What are you seeing? 80% of them say they want to visit something that's historically or culturally important and real, authentic. You know, and there's this thing, a lot of times we used to buy stuff for our kids or ourselves. There seems to be a change. People aren't buying stuff as much as they're buying experiences. They want to experience something real that's really a place. And there are lots of people who are supportive and involved in this right now. Here are some of them. And there are lots of things going on. I put this sign here because it's at the site of Harriet Tubman's very last trip from Maryland to New York State in 1860. It was a terrible trip. Lots of people are doing tours. Lots of people are doing reenactments. And this is focused on African American and Underground Railroad sites. Lots of people are doing exhibits. The Customs House here in this exhibit area is going to join major exhibits in New York State at Brooklyn Historical Society, at Syracuse Onondaga Historical Association, a Rochester Museum and Science Center at this one. There's one in St. Catharines on the Underground Railroad. Lots of publications. I put one here. If you want to follow more about Tubman's life and the context in Auburn and Cayuga County, I did a huge survey several years ago. We found 103 sites relating to the Underground Railroad and African American history. And in 2014, President Obama signed into law authorization for a National Park Service related to Harriet Tubman in Maryland and also in Auburn. And now some of you may actually have voted for her as somebody to put on the $20 bill. And the recent buzz has been this auction of this photograph. The Cayuga County historian looked at this and she said, oh yeah, I saw that in the 80s. It was Emily Howland's scrapbook. I just didn't think anything about it. And it went for $161,000. It's now jointly owned by the Library of Congress and the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I think Harriet Tubman and all of those who escaped, along with the people who helped them, challenge us all to make real the ideals of justice and equality that we think about as citizens of this country and of this world. This story is not dead. That's why it's so compelling. She remains a challenge to us, and her voice continues to call to us. So I invite you all to carry on the vision. Notice the picture in the top left-hand corner. It's people you may recognize. And I invite us all, including me, to carry on Harriet Tubman's legacy in ways that feel right to us in this world as in the future. Thank you so much. I think I talked longer than I thought I would.
Thank you so much. Judy is going to take some questions. So I'm sure she has inspired some of you to wonder about some of the details about what she's talking about. So this would be your opportunity. Anybody? Any questions? Judy, are you ready?
Oh, I'm ready. And Aunt Harriet is here too. She carries us through. Look, short.
She journeyed through Lockport, correct?
Lockport? I don't know if she did or not. I'm not sure. A lot of where she went and details we just don't know. She well could have, but I don't know.
They claim the YWCA was an outlet for the Underground Railroad.
Lockport was a major Underground Railroad center, both because early white settlers were Quakers, and there were 200 African American settlers there, the single biggest settlement of African Americans in Niagara County, except for Niagara Falls. Yes. How long was it? Well, it depends on where you started from. Could be a 1,000-mile journey, or it could be from Maryland here is what, 300 miles, something like that. Think about walking by foot, which a lot of them did. Can you walk that? I don't think I could do it. Yes?
Whatever became of her daughter, her adopted daughter?
Gertie, I don't know what became of her adopted daughter. She also had another young woman, Margaret, that she brought from Maryland in 1860 that she always said was her niece, related to probably her brother Ben. But there's always this persistent sense, was it really her own daughter? Did she really have a daughter herself? We may never know. Margaret Stewart lived in Auburn, though, and her daughter and her granddaughter and her descendants are still there. They live in the house right next to where she grew up and lived, in Auburn.
Question.
Yes?
I have two things. I think you accidentally said she died at 31, but I think you meant 91.
Yes, I certainly did. Thank you.
Where you come from?
I grew up in North Tonawanda, which I found out later, very recently, was a sundown town. So I'm dealing with that legacy, thinking, oh my gosh.
Attention, please.
It's everywhere.
Travelers are advised to secure
Well, I live in
all
Fulton,
personal
New York right now,
belongings.
which is north of
Unattended
Syracuse.
items
Yeah.
may be confiscated. All items should have
Where
identification
African Americans
tags.
were not supposed to
TSA
stay after
regulations
dark.
require Amtrak to undertake random ID checks on board trains.
When I was
Passengers and fewer personal
working
items may
with-
be screened or inspected.
You know,
If you observe suspicious activity or unattended items, please notify police.
When I was
or
working with
personnel,
the
or
youth
call
at a church,
1-800-331
there was a lady that lived on Lonsdale in
0.
Buffalo who claimed to be a great niece of Harriet Tubman.
could be. There's several descendants, and I don't know about her or not. I showed you a couple pictures. I didn't point them out, of Pauline Copes Johnson and Judy Bryant, who live in Auburn still. So, yes.
Gail?
This is probably a good follow-up to her question. I'm from Buffalo, New York. Do you have any stories about Harriet Tubman and the city of Buffalo?
As far as we know, she did not go to Buffalo. Buffalo was a hotbed of the Underground Railroad, though. Michigan Street Baptist Church, William Wells Brown. I think 80 to 90% of the members of Michigan Street Baptist Church listed their birthplace in the census as Virginia. And you know, the story that you probably had tours that they were thinking was, well, they hid in the basement or behind the thing. I didn't find any. I did a big report on the Michigan Street Baptist Church. I found no evidence of people using the church, but the ministers, the ones they hired speaking from the pulpit, were avowedly, many of them had escaped from slavery. I mean, it was just in your face. I just was amazed. And so Buffalo has a rich tradition. A lot of people would come up from like Kentucky or Tennessee along the Ohio River into Buffalo that way, whereas Tubman was coming from the east up Maryland through New York City in this way. So it would have been a way out of her travel pattern to do that.
Thank you.
Yes.
It's interesting you noted earlier the chain migration which had taken place, but studies indicate that people from the same parishes or the same communities, same states, actually set up churches in Buffalo. whether they were bonded or whether they were free.
Right.
People brought together their network and continued
Right.
that network in places like Buffalo.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the things it's the kind of a cutting edge of the research is to begin to pinpoint the way in which they carried those connections, family and community up, because they certainly did.
Right. Like Strangers in the Land of Paradise documents some of that.
Yeah.
We have a
Thanks.
question in the back.
Has the Harriet Tubman Church in Niagara Falls been authenticated?
The Harriet Tubman Church in Niagara Falls been authenticated? I don't know about that.
No.
No?
No.
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 Nope.
Denise might know.
No.
All right.
But didn't they come through Lewiston, homes down in Lewiston?
A lot of people did in Lewiston, yeah. That was another Youngstown, Lewiston, Niagara Falls on this side of the river. And Lewiston was very important, and Gretchen wants to talk about Youngstown.
Yes.
We just finished, my husband, about the Underground Railroad in Youngstown. Can you hear me?
No, no. Here, take this.
Do you really? My husband and I'm Gretchen Doling, and my husband is Dennis. I don't think I can stand. I just had hip replacement.
Just sit, that's all right. People can hear you.
We've been working on the Underground Railroad. We live right on the Niagara River, and I grew up in southern Ohio, which was one of the routes that people took. And Ohio had 19 Underground Railroad trails up through to Cleveland and finally on into Canada. And yes, we have evidence. And we started with the work that Judith did that's on their website. We should mention that perhaps. It's full of information, and any one of you that lives in the area could look at that and start your own research from it. And we have our book coming out June 5th, published by New Ideas, which is part of the Buffalo Heritage Unlimited. And we can definitely, we had a lot of ferrymen, all the ferrymen were involved in some way, and we have people from the other side crossing over, like Samuel Ringgold Ward, and it's very exciting for us to have been able to make these connections.
Yeah.
And I have to thank Judy for being a reader, and Kate Clifford Larson as well, and Bill Bradbury.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes. One more, Lillian?
Basically, it's a Bill question, I think.
Okay.
So I'm thinking about Stephen Mark, the photographs that Stephen Mark, who's a professor at Arizona State,
Right.
I think he had done a series of photographs documenting the Underground Railroad in upstate New York, but also in Ohio and in Mississippi. So basically the eastern half of the United States.
Yes.
And Sandra Olson, former director of the art gallery at UB, has made arrangements for those photographs to be here and to be exhibited. So my question basically is, when are they going to be? Are they going to be a part of that opening, or?
I hope so. We would like to have that work here along with many other works. And let me just say, just right now, first of all, if y'all would just turn around and look at each other, as you filled up this place. I mean, just standing room only. Give yourselves a round of applause.
Yay.
Thank you. That's just amazing. There's so many people here. Yeah, Dennis and Gretchen. We have Susan Geisler here, the sculptress who's done fabulous work all over the area, and Dr. Wellman. There's so much work about to take place here. It's very, very exciting. But it all got started essentially with Judy's research. So we owe Judy a great debt of gratitude. Let's give her a big round of applause. Thank you so much, Judy, for what you did. So, Ronnie, you have a question?
Yeah. There was some talk about erecting a statue between Ontario Avenue, Niagara Avenue, on the Global Tower side of Main Street, on the west side of Main Street. Is that conversation still in?
Yes. In fact, Ronnie, I'd like to invite you to join the Public Art Committee that's working on the site selection for a statue of Frederick Douglass that we want to put in front of the courthouse, because Frederick Douglass was here 1848, right next door at the Congregationalist Church. We believe he may have been the one that caused that church to split. So yes, we're going to have lots of statuary here. Frederick Douglass, we want to do Harriet Tubman. We thought we may want to do Tubman here on these grounds, but guess what? Right across the street, we're going to have another 225 acres of parkland. And we have the trailhead of one of the most beautiful entries to the gorge down below, right across the street. So I'm thinking that the statuary belongs across the street in the park, not in a parking lot at a train station. But, you know, I want you all to understand we are sitting right now in the middle of Suspension Bridge Village. And the mayor of Suspension Bridge Village is sitting right here with us, Dan Davis. Stand up, Dan. Everybody needs to know who you are. Hey. Dan is the guy who's doing the research to put Suspension Bridge back on the map. Because when Harriet Tubman came here, she wasn't coming to Niagara Falls per se.
Amtrak passengers,
she was coming to
each
Suspension
ticketed traveler
Bridge.
is allowed up to 2 carry-on bags, not
let
exceed
that thing
5
talk.
LDS each, and must meet size, type, and content requirements.
Okay, we have
Please
questions.
contact the Amtrak agent or refer to posted carry-on baggage signage for details prior to boarding your train.
Involved.
Yes, yes,
Amen. Did you hear what she said? People, get involved. Come on now.
yes.
Thank you so much. There are a lot of people involved in this behind the scenes. This is not something that just happened today. We've been working on this, me personally, for it seems like my life. Really, it just seems that way. But we've only just begun. We're just beginning. Now, understand, Harriet, we don't know for sure exactly when Harriet Tubman was born. We do know when she died. So I'm inviting all of you, each one of you individually, to be here on the 105th anniversary of her passing on March 10th, 2018, when we officially open those doors.
Yay,
I want all of you here.
yay.
I want each of you to bring your families with you. I'm just amazed that you are all here tonight, even though we were under a severe storm warning, but I told you earlier, that was just Harriet. Yeah. So, all right, any more questions?
No, you mentioned 1848.
Yeah.
When the black men, the abolitionists came here.
Yeah. Douglas.
Well, that's when Parkhurst Whitney, Peter Augustus Porter, Samuel Defoe started the village of Niagara. So that was a very significant time for them to be here.
It was a very important time. You got to understand what was happening. Let's think about it. They were putting a 20-ton locomotive on a bridge over a gorge 200 feet above the raging Niagara River. That was big stuff. So it attracted a lot of people. It opened the door to trade with Canada, now our largest trading partner. But it also opened the door to Harriet Tubman. And Harriet Tubman knew what to do with it. Now, I like to say that Harriet personally probably brought on her own, as Dr. Wellman says, 70 people, probably responsible for freeing at least 700, maybe 800 in that raid. But Harriet Tubman continues to inspire millions of people around the world today who are still trying to get what she saw: freedom, justice, what we called back in those days liberty. The tragedy of the whole story is that they had to leave the United States to get it. You had to go to Canada to be free. The beauty of the story is that the people of Western New York pulled together, worked together to make Western New York, especially Niagara Falls, a safe harbor. It's still a safe harbor because we still are facing the same situation. It's just ironic that right upstairs is immigration. And these guys are serious. I mean, they just look intimidating. You don't want to mess with them. But they create the same kind of tension that the slave catchers created for the people who were just trying to make just that one last step. Like we like to say, one last river to cross. Isn't it just amazing that on one side you can be free and on the other side not? I remember one little story, if I may borrow something from Dr. Wellman, about Harriet Tubman, who said at some point when she finally crossed that line, that imaginary line between freedom and slavery, and she looked at her hands and she saw that nothing on her had changed. Freedom is a state of mind, but it's also a state of reality on one side of the border or the other. And the borders are, and walls are still threatening to come up. That's why what you say is so important. You better stay woke, get engaged. Now, those of you who have not had the opportunity to go through this raw space, here's your chance. I want you all to look at it, and we would like to hear your ideas about what we should do there. Now, we spent a lot of time and a lot of money to come up with a design that I think you're all going to be very, very happy with. There are essentially going to be 3 separate galleries in there that are going to tell a very important story. This wall right here is going to be occupied with storylines. So our little Underground Railroad Interpretive Center will be the tail that wags the dog. Okay? There will be more activity going on in this space that has to do with the Underground Railroad than will ever have to do with people arriving and departing. So this is the place. I want you to come back here just a little over a year, a little less than a year from now, March 10th, 2018, for the grand opening of the Niagara Falls Underground Railroad Heritage Center. Now, unless there are any other questions for Dr. Wellman, let's give her one more rousing round of applause.
Oh, no, you. Thank you all. Yes, thank you, Bill. Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks for being here.